Devil's Reef is a unique biome and also the largest known reef in the world. Bordering the northern circle, the reef is nearly 50 kilometers across from north to south, and it circles most of the globe west to east. The reef is 300 meters below the surface and made from cold water coral rather than typical tropical coral. The Devil's Reef is so massive that on clear days the coral can be seen from the surface of the ocean. The reef acts as a buffer between the relatively safer waters south of the northern circle, and also as its own unique biome beneath the northern circle and the exoteric world. Coral beneath the water is able to sting human flesh and will sting most life that isn't native to the Devil's Reef biome. The combination of temperature extremes and the devil coral that makes up the Devil's Reef acts as an effective barrier between the northern circle and the southern waters of Oceanus. Very few things can survive traveling across 50 kilometers without touching any coral, without any food, and also survive the waters either getting warmer or colder than they are normally used to. Sadly, one of those very few things that can survive traveling over the Devil's Reef are humans. When human fishermen found a pristine biome with new fish and brand new creatures to consume, they did what humans always do. They explore, they exploit, and they explode. Beyond the northern circle, they found brand new fish, new squids, and even brand new gigafauna. Krakens, leviathans, kaiju, and eldritch monstrosities that would dwarf the beasts from primeval and would be strong enough to wipe out entire cities if they ever went beyond the Devil's Reef. The advantage the fishermen had was that they were too small for the eldritch monsters to worry about. Most of the time, at least. Even though fishermen knew that the waters beyond the Devil's Reef were dangerous, sometimes the potential reward was worth the risk to the right fishermen. While most of the time the fishermen could fish beyond the reef safely, there are, however, a few times where the fishermen bring something back from beyond the Devil's Reef. Something that they didn't intend to bring with them. January 1st, 2740. It has been a slim fishing season. I was barely breaking even, and if I don't bring back more fish this month, I am going to lose my home and my boat. Our normal spots aren't yielding much fish, so I am going to take the risk of going past the Devil's Reef. So I told my son, Jimmy, that I was going to be gone longer this trip, because I needed to head past the Devil's Reef. He knew that it was dangerous, but he also knew how much we needed the money. By this point, he was tired of only eating the fish I was catching, especially since the price of cornmeal went up, yet again, so even cornbread is a luxury for us right now. I let my crew know about my plans, and 3 of the older fishermen quit over that news. It pains me to see them go, but I am able to replace them with some newbies who are looking for work. There's always another down on his luck drunk that needs to get paid. As long as they don't drink while we are at sea, I don't care what they spend their check on. With my crew ready, and my boat, the Alert, ready, we made our way out of New Fisher. A few old men tried warning us away from heading to Devil's Reef, but I had to ignore them. Old men always warn against going to Devil's Reef, and most of the time the ships that go beyond the reef are completely fine. Last I checked, we only lost 3 fishing boats in the last 20 years, so I was certain I was going to be alright. January 18th, 2740. We've made it to the Devil's Reef. Coral beneath the water is supposed to be 300 meters below the surface, but the cold white coral could be seen gently dancing to the deep sea currents as we made our way further north, and I warned the men not to look at the coral for too long. Staring at them for a long time tends to have an almost somnambulant effect on anyone staring on it too long. Sorta like snow in the ocean, and you always need to be alert when out on Oceanus. As we passed over the coral, I thought back to what Jimmy told me he learned from an old marine biology book about the Devil's Reef. He said that the coral, despite looking like coral, was actually more closely related to jellyfish than it was to tropical coral, and sometimes the microscopic coral would drift hundreds or even thousands of kilometers before finding the ideal environment to settle down. They were a lot like people in that way. He also said that most of the fish and other creatures that lived in the Devil's Reef couldn't live elsewhere. When scientists tried to take them out to examine, the fish would die in captivity within hours. Even coral samples would die within days, and even trying to move the fish to a different climate would kill the sea life. The sea life here was very durable because it lived in one of the harshest biomes on the planet. However, it was also very fragile because it would die anywhere else. Also, a lot like people. When we made it beyond the Devil's Reef, it felt like there was a change in the air. I could feel an internal pressure behind my ears, like I needed to pop, but I couldn't pop my ears. Even when I yawned or chewed gum, I could still hear, and so could the crew. So we continued even further north, watching carefully for anything that might be a risk to the boat. Tonight, I think we will find our fishing spot. January 18th, night 2740. The lights in the night sky were gorgeous. Gorgeous streaks of green, yellow, and blue danced across the night sky, an aurora unlike anything I saw back in New Fisher. This far north, the effect was more like watching dragons dance, fly, and fight across the sky. It was truly beautiful, and my men and I watched it for over an hour until the cloud cover was thick enough to keep us from seeing it. So now we head to bed. For real this time. I slept in. We all slept in. We slept past our alarms, and the dreams I had were strange. I dreamt that I was standing on the bow of the ship looking out over the seas. From the ocean, I could see a great ziggurat rise from the bottom of the sea, constructed from a strange stone that was white as bone and smooth as glass. On top of the ziggurat was an empty throne, a throne that was, logically, smaller than the ziggurat, but looking at the empty throne, it felt that throne held the weight of the world. And in the dream, I watched as all of the creatures of the ocean swam towards the ziggurat. Each creature threw itself onto the steps of the great temple, all committing suicide for the empty temple, with the empty throne atop it. I saw the fish, the turtles, the sharks, the squids, and even the whales all threw themselves at the steps. And still, there were more steps to cover in death and gore, and the highest levels of the ziggurat were untouched by the chaos and carnage below. Behind the sea creatures, I saw people swimming up to the steps. I screamed at them to stop, for them to leave this unholy place. But that did nothing. More and more people swam up to the temple to sacrifice themselves, and with every death, there was another behind them, willing to climb past their compatriots' blood and body, just for another chance to get a little closer to the empty throne. But no matter how many sacrificed themselves, no matter how many dead there were, the throne was always higher than anyone could reach. Even when the sea was red with blood and so full of bodies that the water could not be seen, the empty throne sat out of reach of everyone's desperate grasp. But no matter what I yelled at the people killing themselves to reach the throne, they didn't care. In their minds, the empty throne was worth dying, killing, and fighting for. Didn't matter if no one saw the throne. Just the fact that they could see the throne was enough to drive every living thing to self-destruction. I wondered why I was immune to this greed when I realized that I wasn't actually standing on the bow of my ship. Instead, I was sitting on the throne. I was dressed in robes of the most vibrant violet that I have ever seen or imagined. The throne I sat on was made of gold with encrusted jewels. As I looked down on all of the little pathetic worms trying to claw their way closer to me, it didn't matter what they were. They could have been a titanic sea serpent or a lowly fish, a prince of men or a king of beasts. Up on my throne of gold, jewel, and violets, they were all equally as pathetic as the maggots and parasites that ate the flesh of the dead. I was the king of all I saw. No, not a king. Something grander than a king. Someone who spoke for the gods. Someone who is a god in living flesh. Someone who was so regal that I could demand blood from others to make my robes violet. I saw all who struggled to reach me, and I had an idle thought to give up some of myself down to the maggots below. I thought of giving up my blood, or my jewels, or even a strip of my own purple robes down below. Instead, though, I decided to not give any of the masses below any part of myself. After all, they were killing each other just to get closer to me. Giving them a piece of myself would end the rabble, and it would end my entertainment. So I reclined in my throne, content to watch the maggots below feed on each other, never getting closer to me. As odd as the dream was, my day started normal, until we saw our first dead whale. Sometimes you will see dead whales. However, something was odd about the dead humpback whale. Across the whale's gray flesh were thousands of barnacles that licked the air and the water. As the boat passed by the whale, there was no blood nor chum in the water. Normally, thousands of scavengers would have started breaking down the whale by now. Instead, the only thing that ate the dead flesh of the whale was the barnacles that covered every square centimeter of the whale. We were careful not to get too close, but even from half a kilometer away, we could smell the rotting guts of the sea mammal. However, once we passed by the first whale, we saw the others. Dozens of humpback whales, all dead together. At least 3 dozen whales were just floating dead in the water, all covered in the same bone-white barnacles, all with no chum, no blood, and no scavengers. We couldn't see any cows in the water, so there were at least 9 different pods of whales who all just decided to die in the same place. Or something killed them. We all agreed to be far from the whales. Leviathans and kaiju both ate whales, and some of them were also scavengers. And the last thing we wanted to deal with was a child of Caribidus, a devil whale, or something worse. That might consider the alert a delicious meal. So we continue even further north for our fishing grounds. An old legend tells that if you suspect a devil whale is in the area, that it isn't safe to fish in. And even if I am agnostic towards most legends and myths. I have been a fisherman long enough to know that when something warns of danger, there is danger, even if you don't know why. I knew that creatures like leviathans, deep ones, and devil whales were just creatures. They had to be. Scary, terrifying, and dangerous, but so are sharks and octopi, and sailors made legends about them too. We found the fishing ground. January 20th, 2740. The fish here are strange. The fish we pull up have no eyes, not because they're blind fish. Their eyes are just gone, completely wiped out of their skulls. Not like something ate their eyes either, they just aren't there. Empty sockets that have only darkness inside of them, but they are easy to catch, and we are filling the freezers down below very quickly. We should be able to finish by tomorrow. I don't like the way the fish look at me. They watch me. Even through the freezer walls, they watch me. Every move I take, every breath I take, every mistake I make, they're watching me. I don't like how they keep moving, even when they're frozen, but they only move when they're not watched. I have to hide from them, but there is nowhere that I can hide from them. They're maggots trying to climb up the ziggurat. They cannot hurt me. They throw themselves into our nets because they prefer death over what is chasing them. January 21st, 2740. Had a hard time sleeping. I kept having nightmares, and at one point I tried writing it down in my logbook. Whatever I wrote last night, I cannot read it. I dreamt again of the throne that towered over the ocean. I dreamt that I sat on the throne, and instead of creatures killing themselves on the steps of the temple to try and reach me, I was surrounded by a quiet earth. I could see to the very ends of the earth, from the highest reaches of the sky to the darkest depths of the ocean. Nothing lived on the entire planet. Nothing except myself. From the mightiest kaiju to the smallest microbe, I was alone in the world, so I stared up to the night sky above. The sun was a red disk in the sky with an empty heart that slowly expanded to consume the disk in its entirety. Like an eclipse, but there was no moon in front of the sun. The stars above were so plentiful that even with the sun consumed by Mammon, leaving emptiness where the sun once was, the sky was full of light that was brighter than even the sunniest summer day. Even as the sun was consumed, there was only one spot of darkness above. A black moon that howled from never-ending grief as I watched the cosmic dance above me. A black moon surrounded by a ring of stellar silver. The sun grew smaller, and the moon grew larger, as the waters surrounded my temple and drowned me. But even as I could no longer breathe, I could not tear my eyes away from the black moon above, whose howls echoed through the water around me as I stared up at the black moon, endlessly fascinated. And then something impossibly large covered the black moon. It both ascended from the southern pole of Luna's obsidian surface, and it also descended from the moon's northern pole, a substance that was the color of a night sky at sunset, covered in countless sparkling, impossible diamonds and jewels that shone like stars, a color that filled me with longing and sadness. It reminded me of heartbreak, lost love, and longing. It was like what I felt at my wife's death, but so much worse. My wife was just dead. As much as I missed her, the very fact she was dead meant that I would see her again, because I too would die someday. Not a comforting thought most of the time, but the very nature of mortality meant we would be together someday. The impossible thing that covered the black moon was a reminder of a love that I would never know, and that I would never see. Even death would be denied to me, as the depths of the ocean pushed me even further away from what covered the black moon, as the impossible covering of the moon parted. The covering rushed down south and north, revealing the impossibly dark moon, as the substance revealed the moon and the silver surrounding it, as it grew closer to me, covering the entirety of the sky as I was pushed further down. Black Moon blinked at me. That didn't scare me. That only filled me with more longing as I reached up to try and reach out to the eye of the one above me. In my dream, I knew that I loved her. In my dream, I knew that I hadn't seen her in so long that I only wanted another moment to see her. It wasn't the night sky above I was looking at earlier. It was her skin. The skin of someone or something impossibly large, impossibly powerful, impossibly lonely, impossibly ancient. My love who had been separated from me for so long that I had forgotten her name, and she had forgotten my name as well, as I reached up for her, and her howling tore through me as I finally woke up in bed and I wrote down what I dreamt. What is wrong with these waters? The sky above is gray, and that makes me full of longing. The pain of missing my wife feels fresh again, and the crew is quiet as they work. They quietly whisper among each other as they work. But I caught a few words. They are all missing someone on land as well, and the sky above, being as gray as the sea below, is making us feel worse. Something feels wrong about the ocean. Even though we are pulling up even more fish, the ocean doesn't feel alive. Normally, the ocean feels alive. Sometimes angry, sometimes happy, sometimes sad, and sometimes an emotion I don't have words to describe. But it felt dead on that day. We finally have reached our final load of fish, and we are running into an issue. Some of the fish have bone-white barnacles on them, barnacles that taste the air with their tongues, that kept licking our gloved hands even as we threw the fish back. But I cut myself on one of the barnacles, and I know a few other men have done so as well. But we aren't talking about it. I think maybe a few barnacles might have made their way into the hole with the fish. However, that's fine. We have more than enough to make it through. We have begun the trip back. January 24th, 2740. The sea is quiet. The sky is quiet. The sailor is quiet. The ship is quiet. The waves crash silently on the decks. I can feel the wind in my hair, but it does not whistle past my ears. I can feel the chill on my skin, but my teeth do not chatter. I can feel the emptiness of my stomach, but it does not growl. I can see the words of my logbook, but the pages do not rustle. I have not dreamed in 3 days. A great relief. Last night I decided to stop sleeping. Even when I sleep, it is restless, my body aches, my eyes are bloodshot, and I feel like I have to keep moving. We passed the Devil's Reef yesterday, and when we did, some of the sailors were thrown over. Only the ones who were dead weight. The men who still slept did not wake up. They were holding us back. Their eye sockets were as empty as the fish. They stared at us, and from toothless gums they whispered to us. When you are in complete silence, you are thankful for the whispers at first. But they whispered the same words over and over. Adam's wrath has escaped none's grasp. Adam's wrath has escaped none's grasp. Adam's wrath has escaped none's grasp. It was not right, and the dead men still moved. They only moved when we did not look at them. They followed me. They were always behind me. They were always whispering. The only sound in the world, and no matter what I did, I could not trap the dead men. They followed. They whispered. They tormented. I threw them all overboard. Some of them still grasped at my hands and arms as I threw them overboard, even though the only words I could hear was, Adam's wrath has escaped none's grasp. I could still read their lips as the dead men begged for their lives. There is only one sailor left other than myself. The sky and the sea are still gray. I have not seen the sun, moon, nor stars in days. I don't remember what they look like anymore. Did the sun ever exist? Or was that just an illusion? A lie we tell ourselves so we don't feel alone in the darkness. Did the stars ever exist, or are they simply Sisyphus's distant stone? Something we can never approach nor push up, always pushed down by them. Did the moon ever exist? Or was the moon always an eye watching me that has decided that I am now too hideous to look at? I am hideous. I hate mirrors. They remind me that I am hideous. My true beauty is inside of me, and it's just covered by this disgusting, rotting, cloying meat that we are born surrounded by. No one brave enough to just remove the dead weight, keeping us from being beautiful. But I am growing more beautiful each day. I saw some of my true beauty shine through a few days ago. The first night I could not sleep. I got up and went to the sink to see if the water could help me calm down. What I saw in the mirror scared me. My skin was sallow, my hair was greasy, my eyes were bloodshot, and my stubble was coming in. So figuring I wasn't getting enough sleep, I grabbed my razor and I shaved away my stubble. Each time I slid the razor across my face, I left more and more of my stubble and my ugliness in my sink. Scrape after scrape, I left dark hair, red flesh, yellow blood, and pink tissue in the sink until it clogged my sink and I decided to dump my stubble into the trash. After I shaved, I was with a permanent smile, my mandible bone shining through, a few fibrous tentacles connecting the mandible to the skull, a few of the barnacle shells clear, but I was just happy to remove some of the stubble. But still, I was hideous. True beauty came from within, but I couldn't let it out yet. I had to let the beauty grow. Each night since then, I have shaved more and more of my body. For the first time in my life, I shaved my legs, my genitals, and my chest, as I finally revealed more and more of my beauty, leaving more and more of my hideousness away, as I exposed more and more fibers and more barnacles. I was careful to leave the flesh beneath the skin as untouched as I could. My beauty needed to feed. We will be home in a few days. I wonder why the other sailor lives in the mirror. January 27th, 2740. I am finally beautiful. January 28th, 2740. I feel incomplete. My beauty wants to grow more, but there is nothing left to feed it. I soak in the freezer with the fish, but it isn't enough. The beauty lives, but it needs more to grow. I feel it inside of me, like the heart of a beating temple. It needs to spread among the others of home. Home. Hum. Hmm. What is my home called? Why can't I remember? Why can't I remember my child's name? Wait, I didn't forget. I knew I didn't forget. My child's name is Beauty. My child's name is Life. My child's name is Death. Adam's Wrath. Adam's Wrath. Adam's Wrath. Adam's Wrath is my true children, and they shall be shared with everyone. I wonder if the sky will ever stop being gray. I wonder if I will ever see night or day again. I wonder if I will ever hear anything other than the whispers of the sailor watches me from above. He is hideous. He is nobody special. Nobody was always on the ship. I just can't see him now. I wonder if he took my dreams, or if I gave them to him. My men returned from the mare. They climbed up the boat, all beautiful, bare bone and barnacle. They carry children of their own, and they hoped to help their children grow. But there isn't enough food in these waters, so they are hoping to help their children home. Nobody is piloting the ship. We work under nobody's watch. Nobody eats, nobody sleeps, everybody works. Nobody rests. Nobody writes for me while I work alongside the men. I wonder if their minds are like mine, or if they are truly beautiful and empty. When we arrive home, nobody disembarks. The men and I unload the fish onto the dock. It must be night for everyone else. There is no darkness for us. There is no light. There is only the whispering shh, the gray, and the mare. The boat tied into place. We wait beneath the dock. We hide in none's bosom. We no longer need shoes kiss to live. In time, they will eat the flesh, and they will carry Adam's wrath, and I will get to join them, and we will find enough food for our children to live. Adam's wrath has escaped Noon's grasp, and like all good children, Adam's wrath is ready to make his own home. January 30th, 2740. I remember her name. She knows my name. I am not the one she's looking for. Mira E. Tu Nut. The Alert pulled into New Fisher with no apparent crew. The logbook was found, but the writing was impossible for anyone to read. Anyone who tried reading the words would forget them soon afterwards. Only if they dictated what it said while it was read, and someone was listening, could it be understood. It could be summarized or copied over. However, the original logbook was impossible to read and recall at the same time. By the time the people of New Fisher knew what was happening, the infection of Adam's wrath had spread across the town, not just from the infected fish, but also from the silent screamers from the Alert, leaving behind both strange infection and stranger writing. Nobody survived, nobody escaped, nobody won. When the Alert arrived in New Fisher, no one noticed the ship's arrival. What is known is that nobody unloaded the fish and that the fish were mixed into the rest of the supply. And even though there was a bit of a stir with the Alert's arrival with no crew, for whatever reason, the town of New Fisher didn't care about the lost captain nor crew. Normally, a ghost ship arriving at the docks would be the talk of the town for months and a legend that is shared for generations. Stories of the first white men meeting the Inuk were so frightening that they are stories that are still shared among many of the tribes of the northern forest. So, a ghost ship with no crew, but full of fish, should have been something worth talking about. And yet, it was barely marked in the ledgers of NF Lumber Company as a returned ship. A check was cut for Jimmy Trout for the fish, and also for the portion of the Alert that Jimmy's father once owned. While everyone else prepared for the spring festival, Jimmy was left alone to try and investigate what happened to his father. No one else had enough of a connection to the Alert to notice how odd it was to have an entire crew disappear, nor could anyone else notice the fact that the ship was being forgotten, that some force was causing everyone to just forget everyone on the Alert. January 31st, 2740. I learned of my father's death after a knock on the door. When I went to the door, the representatives from the company didn't even wait long enough to explain what happened. They just tucked the envelope with 3 checks. The first one is for the fish, the second one is for his portion of the ship, and the final check is for his life insurance. Felt my heart break when I saw it was for life insurance. I collapsed on the front door, and tears burned while falling from my eyes while no one cared. People walked by on the street, sometimes glancing my way, but no one cared enough to try and talk to me. Instead, my golden retriever, Mercury, walked up to me and started licking my face while I cried. All I had was Mercury. My father, who I inherited my name from, is gone. My mother has been gone for years, and now I have Mercury. Still, though, as my tears started drying, I began to wonder, how did my dad die? If the ship came in, then he wasn't lost at sea. The check didn't explain how he died, and the company didn't even bother to explain what happened. So I decided I would have to figure out what happened. After I dropped my checks off. I had lots of experience in managing the house while Dad was at sea for weeks or even months at a time. The house we lived in was a one-bedroom apartment. My dad would sleep on the couch when he was home, but I had a lot of experience in paying bills, dealing with bureaucrats, and educating myself. So I had a lot of practice, but still, I always had Dad out there. He was bringing in money, and he was someone out there. And now my house felt emptier, even if it was exactly as empty as it was yesterday. It felt lonelier knowing that he is never going to come back. I decided to go to the company office to find out what they knew. There has to be a reason why he died. Death always has a reason. January 31st, 2740. Later. I went to the company office in Old Town. The buildings that were first built in New Fisher before being converted into new purposes. The old two-story administration building was now the town hall, and then there was the old lumber mill that was converted into a library that, even decades after it closed, still smelled like sawdust. And then there was the old train station, a station that once ran trains in and out of town, twice an hour, even at night, back when New Fisher was the hub of the NF Lumber Company. And now the station was lucky to get a train twice a week. Attached to the train station was the company administrative building. I think they remained attached to the train station building so they could easily access the only consistent power source and a working phone line in town to do their business with the cities further down south. If you wanted to dial outside of the town, you would have to call the company building and request a call be transferred out. The only other way to contact the outside world was the forest ranger station that has a long-range radio transmitter to connect to other ranger stations. The closest station was in Mermaid Bay, and rumor was that they always had their hands full in Mermaid Bay. But thankfully, New Fisher never really had a need for the outside world, and when you needed something from the outside world, you went to the company building. I enter through the company store. Unlike the general store, the company store prides itself on neatness. Every shelf is straight and organized, and the prices are printed on plastic rather than handwritten on a scrap of paper. And most of the goods here were coated with a thin layer of dust because they were so rarely bought. Seeing the prices on them, I could see why they were so rarely bought. There were VHS tapes from Nippon, translated into common Creole, tapes that weren't even a year old yet. Boom boxes that could play without static and could be heard 3 doors down. And they even had the rarest of all items in New Fisher. Polaroid cameras and film. Cameras that could take pictures of what was going on without having to send the film outside of town and wait weeks or even months for the pictures to be returned, if they ever returned at all. My dad had an old Polaroid at home, and there was still some film on it. Checking these prices in town, I can see why he only broke the camera out for my birthday. Just past the store, there was the much less busy post office. A bored clerk at the desk sold stamps, envelopes, and would collect the rare letter from outside of town, but Sandra Sweet, named Sandy, had another role as the postmaster of town. She was also the town banker, company accountant, and town barista, as she had the only working coffee pots in all of town. Even though she was collecting 4 different paychecks from 4 different jobs, she was perpetually bored. Even as I deposited my checks into the family account, Sandy's eyes glazed over, As she updated her ledger in a big old book that seemed to be 1,000 years old. As she updated it, and she gave me a new form to sign. This confirms that you are the sole existing heir to your father, James Trout Sr., named Jimmy. This confirms that you are Jimmy Trout Jr., too young for a cognomen. She told me as I looked over the paperwork, and I signed it. As I signed it, I asked Sandy, who I spoke to, about my father's death. She yawned as she pointed at the administrator's office, and she said in a very bored voice, "Speak to the chief admin and ask him. But honestly, it doesn't matter," she said in her bored tone, as I asked her what she meant by that, before her eyes turned glassy, and she answered cryptically, "Nobody escapes death, and when you're dead, it doesn't matter anymore," she said in a tone that sounded both callous and also like she was sleepwalking. When I asked her about it, she just shrugged and went back to reading her coffee-stained pulp romance. Realizing I would get no further answers from her, I went over to the chief admin's office. If he has a name, I don't see it anywhere, and he never introduced himself as anything else. The door only said chief administrator, so I knocked on the door and I was called in, and I saw the office of the most powerful man in all of New Fisher. The chief administrator was a white man with more frown lines on his face than hairs on his head. He wore a navy blue suit with a red tie. He would wear the same clothes each day, and in addition to being the chief administrator of the company in town, he was also the elected mayor of New Fisher. Still, he spent a lot more time in this office than he did in town hall. Even when he called me inside his office, he was busy signing numerous documents, and he barely glanced up at me over his spectacles. He grunted towards me, not even welcoming me, as he continued to sign his paperwork, not caring at all that I just lost my father. He didn't even consider me enough to speak first, so I had to ask him. I wanted to know how my father died. I asked him as he glanced up and he went over his ledger, his finger going down the entire list before he finally answered. He was presumed lost at sea. His ship returned without him on board, per Regulation 17, any ship that returns without its crew is presumed dead at sea. If he returns within 3 years, his death will be retracted, and any lost property because of his legal death will be compensated, minus the life insurance payments, Chief Admin said before he went back to his paperwork. So you have no proof that he is actually dead? I asked him, and he shook his head before his eyes also turned glassy, and he explained. We don't have proof he is dead. However, we also don't have proof that he is alive. Nobody was on the ship, and with no proof of life, he is for all intents and purposes dead. If he is recovered, we can change the paperwork. But for now, he is dead, and that is important because rent is still due. His eyes cleared as he explained. The rent contract is still in effect for the rest of the year. If you move out early, then you will owe us the missed rent. So, if I was you, I would get a paying job sooner rather than later, he said as I gritted my teeth and I wanted to yell at him. I came here because of my dead father, but here I was getting reminded that I owe money to the company. I already owe more money to the company this year than I possess because of my father's death. So I would have to get a job, and there isn't a lot of jobs in town that haven't been claimed yet. Oh, and don't forget, we have Fisher Feast for the spring festival at the end of the month. We still need your family's contribution to the potluck, he said as he went back to his work, and I left the office, my fists clenched and my head pounding. I would have to pay rent, find a job, and get food for the potluck. And with my dad dead, I would have to completely give up on schooling. I've only known about my dad's death for a few hours, and I already feel like I've aged so many years. I am so tired, and I am already tired of being tired. I don't have any control. Things are just happening to me, and everyone is expecting me to be ready and to be able to handle it all immediately. I was starting off with debt. The only prospects I could think of in town were the docks as a fisherman, which I really don't want to do, or I could join the forest rangers. I made my way home, where I oiled and checked my rifle, an old standard infantry rifle from my mother before she died. February 1st, 2740. I dreamt of my mother last night, but she wasn't the woman I remembered from the pictures on the mantel. She had long dark hair, skin that was more blue like the sky, with diamond-like stars on her bare skin, and she was crying alone in the forest, so far away from everyone else that she would be vulnerable to the fiends. Except in the dream, I wasn't afraid of the fiends. I was scared of her being alone. So I approached her and she looked up at me and she didn't recognize me as her child. Have you seen my husband? Have you seen my children? She asked me. I opened my mouth to tell her that I was her son, except when I opened my mouth to speak, no voice came out. All I could do was let out a raspy breath. Even with my best effort, I could not make any noise, but the blue woman reached out for my face as she gripped my face in her hand as she examined me closely. She spent a lot of time on my eyes. One of your eyes is golden, just like my son's, but his other eye was silver. Yours is blue, like my own. You aren't him. You aren't my son. You aren't my husband, but you are someone. He's someone who isn't nobody. I can give you a gift, my bloodless child. But know this, child. I can only give you a gift if you do not know what it is first. And I will need to take a price as well. Do you accept it? She asked me and I nodded, only wanting her to spend a little more time with me. But after I nodded, her grip tightened on my head as her other hand reached out for my right eye. I screamed as her sharp nails dug into my blue eye, and she popped it out of my skull. For a brief moment I could see through both eyes as she opened her mouth wide to pop my eye on her long silver tongue. My eye, still connected to the optic nerve, saw my own terrified face from inside of her mouth as she snapped her jaws shut, severing the view and leaving me in greater pain as she held me still with one hand. Even when I tried hitting her or tried fighting, she only held me still as she quietly hummed to herself, and her bloody hand reached above to where the moon was in the night sky. I once had one son who cut out the eye of his brother. I had to have a new eye made out of moonlight, she said as she removed the silver moon out of the sky. She crushed it in her hand, shaping it in with her palm and fingers, like the moon was made out of clay, and she continued with her story. And even when he lost his eye, he traded his brand new eye of moonlight to keep his other brother alive, even in death. I wonder if that is something you would ever decide to do, my child. Or if true sight is something that is worth more to you than the life of another. But then again, your own sight was delicious. So maybe I will keep you around a while longer, just in case I need another eye to snack on, she said as she opened her hand to reveal the clay was shaped into another eye, this one out of silver clay, as she shoved her hand into my skull, forcing the silver eye into my socket, scraping, burning, and squelching into my skull, almost as painful as pulling my original eye out, as she shoved the silvery eye into my skull, and then I could see again. In a way, I could see two different scenes overlaid with each other. In one vision, I could see that she was still a woman I thought of as my mother, and in the other vision, I saw her as something else, something that consumed and covered the entire night sky, something that had every other star above dancing across her flesh, and she didn't notice. But I could see her smiling, a horrible smile that filled me with dread, because this impossibly powerful being saw me and was fascinated by me. And she was definitely not my mother. My mother didn't make me afraid of falling into her. My mother didn't make me fear life. My mother didn't consume my eye only to use it to watch the world below. And as the woman spoke, I could see her speak as a person. And I could see her speak as the sky as well. Now you see truth. A useful tool, but be warned, seeing too much can be painful, but there is only ever one way to stop seeing truth, she said as she opened her mouth to reveal the bloody, mashed up mess of my eye. The eye that I could still see my own face through. When I woke up, I wrote about the dream, and I think I might be struggling to process my dad's death. In the mirror today, I thought I had a silver eye, but it was just a dream. It had to be. Today, I am going to submit a job application at the ranger station. My mother was a forest ranger back when she was alive. There's a few different jobs I can do. Scout, guide, and trailblazer all sound good. Especially trailblazer, because then I can help shape the trails, paths, and roads throughout the forest. That would mean months out on the trail, which would get me away from the town and an opportunity to save up to head into one of the cities. The ranger station is a large log house, at least 50 meters on each side, with a combination radio tower and fire watch tower at the back of the building. It's even built next to the gates leading out of town. The top of the building is adorned with solar panels to provide power even when the generators fail. The garage is a separate building that opens both inside and outside of the town, also covered in solar panels whose sole job is to charge the 4 trucks inside of the garage. The ranger I submitted my application with greets me warmly. The placard tells me her name is Ranger Jane Kelly. If she has a chosen name, it isn't said on the placard. When I hand in my application, she skims it over before she calls me back into the break room for an interview. Then she begins the interview by asking a few basic questions. Do you know how to drive? I've never had a chance to actually drive a car. Do you know how to maintain a gun? If so, what guns are you familiar with? I do know how to maintain a SIR and an 8-shot revolver. I've been doing that for a few years. Do you know how to read and write? I do. I maintain a journal daily. What are some of your favorite books? Marine biology and mythology. This piqued her interest as she wrote something down on her clipboard, and she pulled something off her clipboard and she showed me a printed article. I want you to read this article silently for 2 minutes, and then in less than 1 minute, summarize the article, she said as I read over the article. It was an old news article about a hunting treaty between Winterfell and Toronto. Essentially, with the explosion of deer population, hunting season was being extended an extra month, and the amount of deer that could be hunted was increased by 2 as well. With my 2 minutes over, I explained that to her, and she smiled as she signed that off, and she told me I got the job. I wasn't going to be a trailblazer, scout, nor a guide, but I had the makings of a decent administrative assistant. Apparently, the literacy rates in New Fisher weren't very good. Most people could read some, but reading comprehension was very low with most people, not being able to summarize what they read, let alone read it quickly before summarizing. So I was already starting today. My pay rate wasn't quite as good as it was in the docks, but it would be steady. So I started my shift by organizing the backlog of case files alphabetically. February 1st, 2740, lunchtime. I've been onboarded and I've met the other rangers. Ranger Larry works on the radio. Apparently he sleeps during the day and works mostly at night. Ranger Kelly listens to the radio during the day. And then there's officers Jade and Carlin, who drive the vehicles at night and who act as law enforcement when it's needed. And then other than Larry, Kelly, Jade, and Carlin, there is just me. Apparently they've been short-staffed, and meeting them in person, it has been disappointing. Growing up, you hear stories about the amazing things the forest rangers do. You hear things like how they take out a forest fiend from over 50 meters away with a hatchet, or you hear about them out fighting bears or outrunning speeding cars. Meeting them in person, and the first thing I notice about them is they are all just so tired. Their clothes are rumpled, their hair uncombed, and still there is a determination behind their eyes. I was told that I am making a big difference, but I have a hard time seeing how an admin assistant can help rangers. February 2nd, 2740. I dreamt I saw my father out in the surf, so I ran after him. He looked away from me as he wandered deeper and deeper into the ocean, getting further and further from me. As I waded through the water, my father got further and further from me. Soon I was swimming in the ocean, and still he got further and further from me. The waves pushed against me, trying to push me back to shore, and I could feel fingers caressing my legs as I swam. Still, I swam after my father, who was now barely a gray dot on the horizon, until even that vanished. Then I looked all around me, but I could no longer see the shore. The sky above was as gray as the sea below. The fingers went from brushing my legs to grabbing, and even when I kicked, even when I tried to stay afloat, something kept pulling me below the waves. As I struggled to breathe, I took one last desperate gasp before I finally was pulled below. When I felt the fingers, I expected a mermaid or maybe a man pulling me down. What I saw instead was something else entirely. It was made entirely of fingers. It was like bone-white coral, but made entirely out of fingers that looked all too human. It reached up to grab me in a long arm made of endless fingers, as the abomination pulled me down further and deeper into the water. The abomination of fingers stretched for endless lengths. Everywhere I looked beneath me in the ocean, it was more and more fingers that pulled me further down as I struggled to reach my hands to the fading light above, when something unexpected happened. A massive golden trident, larger than a tree, flew through the water, plunging into the center mass of the many-fingered horror. As its purple blood flooded through the water, and I was let go, I floated towards the surface, and when I broke through, I woke up. My dreams have never been this intense before. February 2nd, later. Something is happening in town. When I went to the ranger station, it was quiet in town. Normally you'd hear people at the docks at this time, or you'd see the butcher, baker, and candlestick maker hard at work. But I walked to the ranger station alone. And it was 8 a.m., so a lot more people should have been awake. When I arrived, Ranger Kelly told me that the officers were dealing with an altercation down by the docks, and they haven't returned yet, and she needed me to keep the station locked while she went to go check on them. Other than her and I, there is only Ranger Larry, and he is both ill with blood-eye shots, and he's trying to sleep. So I will hold down the fort at the ranger station while Kelly checks on the officers. It's been quiet in the station, and it is noon now. Ranger Jane Kelly hasn't responded to any attempts to reach her on the radio, so I've checked the frequencies for those in town, thankfully all written down on a handy piece of paper next to the radio, but no one is responding. The ships aren't responding, the mayor's office is silent, and even the company office is not picking up. And I know it isn't the radio, because I can pick up signals from Winterfall, and I can pick up a signal from a station that calls itself Diamond Heart Radio, and from there I heard a few different songs. New songs I haven't heard before, and after the songs were done, though, something strange happened. A familiar voice spoke on the radio. My voice. And I knew it couldn't have been a recording, because the voice didn't sound like a recording. It's hard to describe, but you know how your voice sounds different when played back to you versus how it sounds when you speak out loud. The voice sounded like how my voice sounds to me when I speak out loud. I heard my voice read a news message I hoped was a joke. Instead, it sounded like something else entirely. With the recent addition of Newt into New Fisher, that brings the amount of Olympia-class entities to 4. I clarify, we now have confirmed reports of Adam's Wrath, Newt Voidburn, none of the Abyss, and nobody special, all within New Fisher. So any interference from any other Olympias is not possible without triggering a Megiddo-level crisis. So, to any survivors left in New Fisher, I recommend heading to the church. Right now there is only one listener in New Fisher, right now. I felt ice crawl up my spine when I heard that. There was no way the speaker could know it was me. Could they? I say again, I know you don't believe me, but right now you are the last standing forest ranger. You need to warn your town before it's too late. The voice said before the station became static, and nothing I could do would bring it back to life. I wanted to believe it was fake, but I knew deep in my heart that it wasn't fake. But I couldn't be the last forest ranger. Larry was still here. I heard a thump from the bunks as the door opened just after the thump, and I could see what was left of Ranger Larry. I could see that Larry tore at his face and his fingertips. His lower jaw was exposed, with bare bone visible, bone that was still attached to the upper jaw by long, thin fibers that tunneled through the flesh. Fibers were connected to the bone by barnacles that licked the air, and I could see they weren't the only barnacles on his body. Across his body, I could see it was honeycombed through, with barnacles that burrowed through his flesh and were embedded in the bone, leaving his chest to resemble a honeycomb as he lurched forward, leaking pus, blood, and stomach acid through the holes, fluids that smoked, and when it fell, it evaporated like water droplets on an iron skillet. As he stepped towards me, I could see his eyes. They were bloodshot with tiny hair-like tentacles that waved just behind his cornea. Every single hole in his body produced these hair-like tentacles as he stepped closer to me, in desperation, but not before throwing the first thing my hand could grab, a coffee pot. The steaming liquid splashed across his body, and even when the glass cut the flesh, he did not slow as he stepped closer. Thankfully, he wasn't quick, but I now had a moment to think. I went to the gun cabinet where I entered the passcode I learned just yesterday. Removing the rifle from inside, I chambered around and I aimed it carefully at Larry's head before pulling the trigger. His cranium above his eyes fragmented, leaving him only his nose and his upper jaw behind, since his lower jaw also fell from the force as he fell to his knees, and despite having no mouth, there was a long rasp from his throat as he fell forward, leaving behind bile and blood on the carpet that quickly evaporated along with his fallen flesh. As I stepped over his corpse to make my way to the radio. Larry must have died recently, and his body returned as a forest fiend. Although, with what was said on the radio, I would feel more comfortable if I got more help from outside the town. So I called out to Mermaid Bay and told them that there were no more rangers and that the forest fiends got into the town somehow. They advised me to try and stay put, that help would be sent as soon as they could. But it would take time, and they also advised the fact that the church was where people were supposed to go, so I would have to let them know over the radio. So I tuned to the emergency broadcast and I warned everyone in the town to make their way to the church. And when I tuned back to the forest rangers, I felt something grab me. With the radio still on, I turned to see that Larry was grabbing me with one hand, and with the other he smashed the radio. His head was still almost completely gone, but those disgusting cilia had grown even longer after the loss of his head. Nearly a meter long, those abominable tongue fingers licked the air and wrapped around my arms as they dug into my flesh, and I tore away from the abomination. The cilia squirmed across my skin like worms as I tore away from Larry, and he turned what was left of his head towards me as another raspy moan escaped the throat. I quickly grabbed a bag and all the ammunition I could carry as I made my way outside of the station. I have one stop to make. February 2nd, 2740, night. I made my way home. On the way, I could see strange hieroglyphic writings on the roads and houses. Hieroglyphics that I could only see with one eye, but not the other. I don't know what they can mean, but it hurts my eyes to try and read them. Like it's something made for burning my eyes. And then there's something else that doesn't make sense. All of the doors are open. Every house is broken open, and I don't see any bodies. The only blood is used to make the marks that I can only see with one eye. Marks that smoked and slowly evaporated. When I make it home, the door is busted open, and I can hear Mercury's quiet yips inside. He would only yip like that when Dad made it home. I quickly enter the house, and I point the gun inside, not sure what I would see. What I did see was not something I expected. On the couch was a skeleton covered in those gray barnacles, with the cilia acting as tendons and muscles, moving the bones of the body, as the skeleton pet the head of the dog. Even with all of his skin missing, I recognized the way he pet the dog, with 3 fingers carefully combing through Mercury's hair, as the skeleton turned its empty sockets to me. "You made it home," I told what was left of my father, as the monster shoved Mercury off his lap and he stood to make his way towards me, his body covered in far more cilia than Larry. As the cilia reached out for me, and I aimed the gun at his chest, pulling the trigger. I didn't kill him, but I knocked him down as I grabbed Mercury's leash, and he excitedly followed me as we made our way to the church. On the front doors of the church, the only doors that were untouched in the entire town, was another odd hieroglyphic. Made out of black ink instead of red blood was an eye. An eye I could only see through one eye. I knocked on the church doors and I was let in. There are dozens of others here. I hope we make it until the forest rangers come to town. But everyone keeps staring at me like there is something wrong with me. But I can see that they all have bloodshot eyes. February 7th, 2740. I've not eaten in 5 days. All of the food that they have looks rotten and is dirty to me. Even when I broke open a can of beans I found in the back cupboard, it was rotten and full of corruption. So I just gave it away. I can see that corruption is inside of them all. They watch me from their empty sockets, but they still eat and eat. They're all so hungry that they eat my dreams. Every time I close my eyes, I can see their eyeless faces staring at me while I sleep. They're infected. They have to be. Yesterday, I saw one scratching at his arm, and some of his flesh fell off. The flesh was tasty. I counted my bullets. I have enough to kill them all. Their flesh isn't dirty. I can eat them. They can feed me. Something is in them. Something that is lacking in myself that they can provide. Nobody whispers in my ears. His thoughts and his words infiltrate my mind. I can see him through one eye, but not the other. I think he is changing me, but I cannot fight him. No one else can see him, and when I try to strike him, my fist falls through his body, like a shadow. When I look in the reflection, I see nobody staring back at me. Nobody is a parasite, something deeper and darker than Adam's wrath. He followed my father, and he is attached to me. If I die, then he'll just spread to someone else here, but I can trap him. Even if I don't sleep anymore, Nobody still rests, and while he sleeps is when I can plan, when I can act. Nobody needs them all alive. He doesn't realize I've been starving myself for days for a reason. If they die before me, then he will have a body that is too weak to escape, and he will die in this church. I know he will just be reborn as the shadow of the Violet Pharaoh, but I need to contain him. The others fear the silent screamers outside. They don't realize that nobody is far, far worse. As vile as Adam's wrath is, those parasites keep nobody contained. They will die in time, and I will face my judgment with my head held high. If there was a better way I could deal with this, I am sure that Hades will tell me. If I burn for this, then I will accept the flames with open arms. And I am sorry, Mercury. I cannot kill us. It's important that we starve together. We cannot let nobody escape. I will kill the youngest first. A knife through the rib cage, and when everyone's heart is stopped, a bullet through the skull to keep them from returning. Thank you, Newt, for letting me see truth. This is one of the largest hunters' lodges in the world. With nearly 200 ships and almost 1,000 members, the Argonauts focus on dealing with monsters at sea or from the sea. Just like the Coastal Guardians, they will deal with kaiju, leviathans, and primevalian beasts. Unlike the Coastal Guardians, however, they were not loyal to any one government. While most of their paying contracts were with governments, they also would protect people who couldn't afford to protect themselves. From protecting coastal towns from Draugen to clearing cruise ships of sufferers, from protecting human children from mermaid predators to protecting mermaid children from human predators, the Argonauts kept themselves busy, building a reputation for being a reliable hunter that people could rely on in even their darkest times. And while having a great reputation can come in handy when you want to strike fear in your enemies or inspire confidence in your allies, a great reputation doesn't stop bullets. Confidence doesn't make a monster's bite any weaker, and having allies doesn't help when you're dealing with a pathogen. Close allies turn into vicious enemies when they believe you're carrying a disease. It doesn't have to be a literal disease either. News of defeat, failure, and mistakes have a habit of spreading quicker than influenza, rendering even the staunchest of allies into unreliable flakes. And the news doesn't have to be accurate to have some of that same effect. Even rumors can ruin a reputation, and that is why rumors are shared slowly among the Hunters Guild. Sometimes, however, it isn't a rumor that can ruin a reputation, but the truth. The truth of mistakes, failures, and defeats can serve as powerful lessons, but that does not make them any less painful. While the Argonauts have a powerful reputation, that reputation is also tempered by the failure of one of their best crews. The incident that created Exclusion Zone 24, formerly the town of New Fisher in the Northern Forest. I am sharing this story not just so we can learn from this incident to keep another one from occurring, but to also remind everyone out there that feels like a failure, that even the best among us make mistakes, and even heroes learn. A week before the Argo 15 arrived in New Fisher, a member of the Forest Rangers reported to the Argonauts that no one had heard from the town in a long time, and that they were worried they were in danger. The town was in the territory of forest fiends, so there is a distinct possibility that the town was overrun. With the distance between the nearest ranger station and New Fisher, it was quicker for the Argonauts to check out the town. The Argo 15 had the same crew for nearly 5 years by this point. a crew whose names had been changed to protect the deceased. It was led by Captain Medea, a hunter who had experience on 3 different continents and who had over 50 confirmed monster kills. An experienced hunter who always prioritized innocent lives over killing the monster, and who was considered one of the best of the Argonauts. Her husband, Jason, was the investigator, a well-educated man who had 2 different PhDs in 2 different fields of mythology, along with a minor in marine biology. While at the time he had never killed anyone, he loved Medea deeply enough to follow her on her trips around the world, offering support both in an emotional sense and also by offering information on the creatures they ran across, earning Jason the nickname Lore Keeper. Because his weapon was always his notebook and a pocket knife he only ever used as a tool. The 2 support members of the Argonauts were the brother-sister duo of Apollo and Artemis. Little was known about them, except they were high school dropouts who worked the docks as soon as they turned 18, and when Medea offered them work as deckhands, they took it. They had proven to be reliable workers for the last 5 years, providing support as the crew of the Argo 15, and providing some support for the hunts. The town of New Fisher was once a company town, an outpost of the NF Lumber Company, producing lumber and fish for the company further south, until eventually the town gained its own charter, and while 90% of the town still worked for the NF Company, was officially independent. The docks definitely showed the fact that it was a company town. The ships meant for carrying the lumber and the fish for the company were massive ships meant for carrying hundreds of tons, while the few civilian boats were little more than dinghies with a motor. The dock was deserted, pallets full of rotten fish that were buzzing with flies, but none of the seagulls were eating the fish, nor were any of the thin cats nor dogs interested in any of the fish that lay on the docks and on the ships. "Something is wrong with the fish," Jason observed as the others nodded, and he explained his thought process. "Judging by how rotten the fish are, it's been at least 7 days out in the sun, but with how thin the birds, cats, and dogs are, that means not only are they not eating the fish, but they aren't eating most of the food in town. So there is something in the fish that wildlife can sense and don't want to consume. It might be a chemical spill, heavy metal, parasite, or something else. The fact that the fish aren't moving means that they didn't die here. They died out at sea. Artemis, please investigate some of the fishing boats to find the last location they were fishing at. That might give us a clue," Jason said as he tapped his chin, and he pointed into the town proper. "I think we should start at the church, and if we don't find anyone, we then try town hall, and then the ranger's post. If there are any survivors or answers, we should find them there. And everyone remember, we need to be back at the boat an hour before sunset. When the sun sets, we don't want to be in town. If there's fiends, we don't want to encounter them," Jason said with a knowing nod, shared with everyone on the Argo. Undead were unpleasant to deal with, and the fiends especially so. They feared sunlight and heat and little else. Unlike most forms of undead, they could repeat actions in death that they did a lot in life, including using tools, weapons, or their own work. They were also invulnerable to holy items, and for whatever reason, the curse, spell, or whatever brought them back to life only applied to things that died in this part of the northern forest. So dead things brought in didn't come back to life, but it also meant that anything undead that left this part of the forest stayed undead as well. The only reason the forest fiends weren't further spread was because the plants of the northern forest would quickly grow over any fiend that stopped moving for more than a few minutes, rendering most of these zombies little more than fumbling fertilizer, since most decayed too much to move in mere days. It was only with the advent of towns like New Fisher did the fiends become a threat. With less plant life in the towns, especially inside the buildings themselves, the fiends could last longer and prove deadly to the people. Because of this fact, most towns in the northern forest would tie together the feet and hands of their dead to keep them from escaping after death, and burials were often done without a casket to allow roots easy access to the squirming bodies. Still, even with careful preparation, every once in a while the fiends would wipe out a town or village. All it takes is just one fiend to go unnoticed long enough to kill a few more people, who then become fiends, and then those fiends went on to kill a few more people. The next thing you know, the dead outnumber the living, and they don't need to last long to wipe out an entire town. It was with this expectation that Medea and Jason explored the town of New Fisher. The first thing they noticed as they went down the town streets was that the town looked like it was abandoned in the middle of the day. Toys, bikes, and cars were just left on the streets and on people's lawns. And the houses themselves all had their doors broken open. They even investigated a few houses to find that every single door was broken open. Even the cabinets, closets, and fridges were all broken open, which was noted because that behavior had never been seen before. While a few broken doors were to be expected, especially for fiends trying to get to someone, fiends don't break open every door there is. Then there was how clean every house was. In a few homes there was rotten food left on the counters, crawled over with insects, but not other scavengers. But there was no sense of panic inside the homes. If it wasn't for the rotten trash, forgotten food, and smashed doors, all of the homes would have looked like normal homes. So, the couple continued their trek into the town, where things were more wrecked, but closer to what Medea and Jason were expecting. As odd as it was to say, a place where the homes were simply abandoned, with no sight of fight nor flight, was a lot more upsetting than evidence of a fight or attempted escape. It meant the difference between a tangible threat that could be fought or an intangible threat that simply wiped people cleanly away. In all of Medea's years of hunting, she would rather deal with a tangible threat than an intangible one, even if it was not a threat that she could fight. Tangible threats could be understood, they could be fought, they could be avoided. Even if you weren't strong enough to handle a tangible threat, you at least knew that it could be overcome. The world she dealt with was dangerous, but at least it was real, it was physical, it had solutions. The world her husband read about and told her about while they were out terrified her to hear about. Stories about witches that could remove their skin to reveal only fire beneath. Stories about shapeshifters that could steal artistry from gods. Stories about unkillable heroes tricking death into suicide. These stories terrified Medea on a deep level. The idea of a world out there that she couldn't ever hurt, but could easily hurt her, scared her. It was easy to deal with a forest fiend. You can see the undead, and you could kill it again. It was a lot harder dealing with whatever was bringing the forest fiends back from death. Whatever that was, it might as well be a force of nature to her. Something she could never understand, and the more she thinks about it, the more it disturbed her. The idea of something so powerful with no explanation had no place in her worldview. Except here it was. So she dealt with the tangible, and she left the intangible wandering to her husband. She didn't understand how he kept himself from being terrified, but she trusted him, and she loved him. And that would be enough to stop herself from the dread of thinking about the esoteric nature of her world. When they saw the overturned truck, Medea let out a sigh. Sure, the truck was empty, but there was blood in the cabin, and bullet holes in the nearby buildings. Medea crouched to examine where the bullets were coming from, and she could see that it all came from inside of the truck, like they were firing at something surrounding the car. What was odd was the only blood was inside of the truck, none around the truck, nor was there a body. So whoever was in the truck, they were firing at a threat that didn't bleed. That narrowed down what the threat could be significantly. There were very few monsters that don't bleed, and while none of them were good, they all feared sunlight, so they continued their trek to the church. The church was so far the only building they found that still had a door, and although it was clearly worn down with numerous scratches and gouges on the heavy wooden door. A door marked with the Eye of Horus in black ink over the golden cross. This also brought pause to both Medea and Jason. Jason, what is something that doesn't bleed but can enter holy ground? She asked her husband as he quickly went over everything he knew. The monster had something to do with the fish that were brought in, because the animals were refusing to touch the fish. The monster had a physical presence because the doors were all broken down, and if it was something like a phantom or a banshee, it wouldn't have bothered with the doors. The monster didn't bleed because there was no blood around the site of the battlefield. The only blood was inside of the truck's cabin. And finally, there was evidence that it was trying to break into the church. A church that was marked with two different holy symbols, so it couldn't be vulnerable to holy ground. He quickly skipped down the list. It wasn't a demon, it wasn't a fiend, it wasn't a hitchhiker, it wasn't a cursed corpse, it wasn't an angry angel, it wasn't any kind of spirit. It wasn't a contaminated cadaver because they would have noticed the chemical smell by now. That only left something of Eldritch origin. While not all Eldritch beings shared this trait, a typical trait shared by most of them is that their bodies, their blood, and all traces of their existence dissolved and evaporated within minutes after their death. The Deep Ones, Twins of God, Levantine, Leviathan, and Stingy Stygian, all eldritch creatures that just disappeared soon after death, not even leaving blood, smoke, ashes, nor dust behind when they died. So while Jason did not know what kind of eldritch being this was, he was fairly certain it was something of eldritch origin. He told Medea he knew it was eldritch, and it was almost definitely not a kaiju nor a leviathan, because the ships in the dock were still there, and he did not know how the eldritch monster tied to the fish in the dock. Deep ones were the right size, but they also would have taken all of the fish, regardless of the quality. Medea knocked on the door and listened closely to hear if there was movement inside. And sure enough, there was movement that she heard. So with that knowledge, Jason pulled the door open, and Medea aimed her rifle into the church where they saw the remnants of a massacre. All of the bodies were piled far from the door. They were days old with maggots crawling across the flesh, consuming what was left of the corpses. Each of the bodies had a large gunshot wound in their heads to keep them from rising from the dead, and the drag marks along the floor told Medea that the bodies weren't shot to death. They died in their pews, and they were dragged away from the doors, then shot in the head. One body was still clutching a gun in its death grip. The body that clutched the gun in its right hand couldn't have been older than 12 years old, judging by the colorful clothes it still wore. The face had rotted off, leaving bare bones exposed and eye sockets that only had maggots inside of the socket. Resting its head on the corpse's lap was a long dead Labrador dog, the fur lined with flies and maggots, and the exposed bone peaked beneath the dog's skin as the fiend hound still nuzzled its head into the lap of its dead master. A dead master that was still petting the dog even after death. The left hand was skeletal, with bare strips of ligaments and flesh barely holding the fingers together, as the fiend child pet the fiend hound in a manner that made it clear this was how the fiends spent their last few moments of their life together. The last few moments of life that were preserved after death by the curse on this part of the northern forest. The fiend child turned its head towards Medea, where her hand shook, seeing the carnage inside of the church. She expected the fiend to turn on her, or to at least try to get closer, avoiding the sunlight at least. Instead, what she saw was the fiend child lift its gun to the fiend hound's head, and it pulled the trigger. A click indicated that the gun was out of bullets, as the fiend child pleaded with Medea. Medea's hands steadied as she fired the first bullet into the fiend hound's skull. The hound's skull exploded into fragments, and the fiend child stopped petting the furry abomination as it leaned its head forward. Loose maggots fell from its eye sockets onto the body on its lap. Its head was offered to Medea as she fired into the fiend child's skull. The body slumped forward without its head. Medea glanced around the inside of the church for another moment, and other than the movement of the flies and maggots, there was nothing. But she turned away, and Jason put on his own mask before he went into the church. When people find out that they are dying, they tend to leave notes, journals, or some kind of record of who they were or what happened. One of the most human things in the world was wanting to preserve your own memory, and it was where Jason had his greatest strength. He knew where people would keep their own memories, and it left Medea outside for a few minutes to deal with her own feelings. Fiends didn't behave like that. Most fiends were hostile to human life, or if they weren't hostile, they ignored humanity. That fiend child wasn't ignoring her. It communicated with her that it wanted both the fiend hound and itself to be killed. Whatever necromancy animated those dead bodies gave it a fear that was deeper than hunger, deeper than anger, and deeper than self-preservation. And as unnatural as fiends feel to humanity, they were a natural part of the northern forest. A scavenger and apex predator, the top of the food chain and also the decomposer that fertilizes the massive trees of the forest. The only thing that could cause an apex predator to behave this way would be an invasive species. Jason soon exited the church with the remnants of a journal as he read it through quickly, and he gave Medea the basic notes of the journal. The fishermen went fishing beyond Devil's Reef, another hard line in the northern circle between the exoteric and the esoteric worlds. You can think of it as the thermocline between the Eldritch and exoteric ecosystems, or as a veil. With the firm knowledge that the threat was eldritch in nature, Jason and Medea made their way back, while Jason explained what the residents recorded. The journal said that the fishermen and those that ate the fish were the first affected. Regardless of how well they cooked the fish, they all got infected with it. Then the infection was explained in detail as Jason explained exactly what was happening. The first symptoms were always physical: skin pulsing, eyes turning bloodshot, then hives form on the skin. hives that developed into holes in the skin, holes that had tongue-like cilia sticking out of the holes, resembling barnacles that licked the air, and the victims would taste through these tongues, and they couldn't be removed because these holes made their way down to the bone, and these creatures burrowed into the bone itself. And the people were still alive, no matter how much the parasite ate their bodies, even when their flesh was more holes than skin, and they were supported by the worming parasites. They would scream until the parasites ate into their vocal cords, and they still wandered the town. And when they got close to anyone uninfected, the parasites would flee from the infected body to the uninfected body, leaving behind a body that decomposed and evaporated quickly. The final pages indicated how they hid in the church and how people started to go insane, and that the writer of the journal killed everyone else before shooting each of them in the head, leaving only the writer and their dog alone. And the last few pages confirmed it was called Adam's Wrath. And it also confirmed that the writer shot all of the residents of the church today. So even though they had been dead for a long time, the writer let them walk, eating their falling flesh until letting himself die. Possibly hours before the Argonauts arrived, possibly minutes before they arrived. With how rotten his body was, though, that could have only happened if the writer had already been dead. Probably for days at least, if not weeks. Which should not be possible. Fiends don't write. They don't operate guns, and they certainly don't operate radios. Whatever undead that boy was, it wasn't a fiend, and it wasn't Adam's wrath. It wasn't anything the Argonauts are familiar with, and it isn't anything that the journalist is familiar with. Adam's wrath was the word that was the final clue Jason needed to identify what the threat was. Adam's wrath was a parasitic species that superficially resembled barnacles, but the parasites had several life stages. They were born as microscopic organisms that would be eaten by planktivores, where they would grow in the fish, and then get eaten by bigger and bigger fish, until finally they were ingested by leviathans, kaiju, krakens, and other similar gigafauna, where the parasites would grow to their full size as human-sized parasites, feeding on gigafauna blood, usually unnoticed by the host. However, humans were obviously a lot smaller than kaiju, so they would be completely eaten by the parasites. The only good news was that Adam's wrath wouldn't get a chance to grow to their full size, so they wouldn't be unable to reproduce. Eventually, the parasites would starve and then die, and then the fiends they turned into would rot and die out before spreading, which was a small comfort until they made it back to the docks, where Medea and Jason found the missing people of the town. Where the Argo once was, it was now aflame, and inside of the flame stood the bodies of those taken over by the parasites, who even now were silently screaming as the fire burned away the human flesh. But the parasite and the shells that covered their bone were unfazed by the fire. The silent screamers were, by this point, more parasite than actually human. Their bones still resembled human bones, but instead of ligaments were worm-like cilia, acting as ligaments and muscles, moving the bones like jerky marionettes. All over the bones were numerous barnacle-like shells, as the bones rattled as they staggered and stalked. In the center of the horde of silent screamers were the remains of both Apollo and Artemis. Their blood and viscera coated the fingers of the screamers, and the twins both screamed with no breath in their lungs as the parasites dug into the flesh of the twins. The worm-like cilia dug in and out of the skin like a possessed needle and thread, dragging its shell into the flesh of the two support hunters, leaving their pockmarks of shell and cilia that burrowed into the flesh as the parasites dug into the bones of Adam's Wrath's newest victims. The bodies twitched and lunged up like puppets who just learned how to walk, as these bodies joined the other silent screamers, who all turned to face both Medea and Jason. Medea aimed her rifle at the closest silent screamer and fired directly at the skull. The skull exploded, and they both watched as the cilia and barnacle shells hold the skull fragments back together. Not even slowed by the bullet, both Jason and Medea could only do one thing: run. Both ran from the silent screamers and towards the gate of the township. The gates were created to keep out the fiends of the forest. The gates that now confined the silent screamers and also the hunters inside of New Fisher. Thankfully, the gates were like most other gates in the northern forest, equipped with a combination lock with the combination printed on the outside to only allow the living in or out. They left the town and they slammed the gate shut behind them before locking it again as they made their way down the road. The two of them, the only survivors of New Fisher, as they slowly made their way to another town. After Jason and Medea shared their story to the next nearest town, a mixed force of forest rangers, vanguard, and argonauts returned to New Fisher, only to find the town burned down and infested with forest fiends with no silent screamers to be found. However, due to the nature of the infection that spread among the town, the road leading to the town was blocked off, and the entire area was declared an exclusion zone. No one allowed in, and no one allowed out. Jason and Medea continued to work for the Argonauts, but New Fisher is still considered a dark page for their long history of hunting. Nobody got in, and nobody got out.